Hey, yo, the pizza here. My ears burn.
So, I like Thomas. Hey guys, it's the Eliminator speaking, and this year is very important, as it marks the 80th anniversary of Thomas the Tank Engine, as well as the books that the series is based on. Thomas has meant a lot to me throughout my life, as well as the lives of many others. In fact, I almost considered making a Thomas-themed YouTube channel, but I chose not to since I had a wide variety of topics I wanted to talk about. You know, I could have just said I felt insecure about it, but jokes aside, Thomas is such an expansive niche that you kind of have to dedicate the majority of your content to it. You've got the malls that cemented Thomas's iconography for the majority of people, CGI, which eventually won people over but then proceeded to squander it, and the reboot, because nostalgic IP now different. However, something I think even the fanbase tends to overlook is the Railway series that the characters are all based on, more specifically the art in them. Thomas's illustrations have such a storied history behind them, spanning 66 years and 6 illustrators. And now that I have an associate's degree in art and animation, I think now would be as good a time as any to talk about them. Just a side note, I'm only going to be talking about the main Railway series, so anything like magazine stories or one-offs aren't really going to make this list. Also, the majority of my information is going to be pulled from the Thomas the Tank Engine wiki, so sound off in the comments if any of the information I relay conflicts with what you've heard. So, with that said, let's get started. Thomas began in the early 40s as a series of bedtime stories that Wilbert Awdry would tell to his son Christopher while he was sick in bed. After a bit of convincing from his wife, Wilbert would write the stories down and eventually go to have them published. They would accept, but only on the condition that Awdry found a proper illustrator for the books, as the art that he had done himself was deemed inadequate by the publishers. Which is where we meet our first two illustrators, William Middleton and Reginald Payne. Middleton came first, as he actually had connections to the book's publisher, Edmund Ward. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't for his ability to draw. At least that's what Awdry would tell you. In all seriousness though, Middleton had made his living as a lithographic artist, so traditional illustrations were out of his wheelhouse. And it definitely didn't help that he didn't have too much faith in the stories, so he put less effort in. But with that history aside, let's take a look at Middleton's actual illustrations. Now, Middleton would only be the illustrator for one book, that being the 3 Railway Engines, published in 1945. And despite being the series' first official illustrator, his art still feels like a massive departure. Now, among other children's books, especially at the time, Middleton's illustrations don't really stand out. But with the knowledge of what Thomas and them would become, as well as the ideas and plans that Awdry had for them, things are really interesting. I'd say that Middleton captures the idea of Thomas and his friends as children's characters. Now that isn't a bad thing. What I mean by that is that all the art is extremely simple. None of the engines really have any sort of clear basis like they would later on. You might see 1 or 2 people and everything, or you might see little bits of scenery to indicate where the engines are, but otherwise it's nothing crazy. Though for Awdry, it wasn't really up to his standard, so Middleton didn't return, which is where Payne comes in. Not long after the first book's publication, Payne would be brought on by Awdry himself to illustrate the second book in the series, Thomas the Tank Engine, and right out the gate you can see a massive difference in how each illustrator approached their work. Where Middleton's illustrations were very simple and only really include the basic outline of a train, Payne made a very concerted effort to make sure that Thomas and the others were different from one another. Awdry had actually sent Payne multiple drawings of different types of engines, so he'd know how to illustrate the characters, and for the most part he followed them. Though, Payne was from a different part of the UK, so he based some of the designs off engines he'd seen there, specifically Thomas, who went from this to this. Luckily, Awdry didn't stay mad at Payne for long, as he made it very clear that Thomas is based off a real steam engine. On top of that, Payne just had some really good artwork. As I mentioned earlier, Payne based all the illustrations of Thomas and the others off of real steam engines that were around at the time. But at the same time, I like how he still made the designs very easy to read, which helps them to maintain some semblance of iconography. I also think he does really well with the engine's faces. Thomas is the main character whose face that we see everywhere, and he does a really good job of depicting the range of emotions he goes through. Almost every other illustration shows Thomas with a mischievous grin, highlighting his more irreverent nature early on, and then manages to do a 180 by showing Thomas in situations where he's sad, scared, or determined. which definitely helps to showcase his character. But other than that, I can't really say that Payne did too much different from Middleton, aside from the fact that he actually illustrated the ground beneath the rails, and gave the rails themselves more detail. Looking back, I definitely would have loved to see what Payne would do with the series moving forward, because I definitely think his art is pretty solid for the most part. Unfortunately though, this is where our story takes a more tragic turn, as not long after the release of Thomas the Tank Engine, Payne would suffer from mental health issues, and 1 year later would die, with the prevailing theory being influenza. And just like that, Awdry was back to square one. Luckily though, the publishers would actually come to his aid for once. Which brings us to the next illustrator on this list. Like Middleton before him, C. Reginald Dalby was a recommendation made by the publishers. However, where Middleton had connections to them through his lithographic artwork, Dalby was a more traditional illustrator, and so they thought he would be a good fit. As a result, in 1947, Dalby was given sketches that he was asked to work on for the series' next book, James the Red Engine, published in 1948. However, unlike the other illustrators up to that point, Dalby actually stuck around for multiple books, working pretty consistently up until 1956. With his final book, Percy the Small Engine. Though Dalby didn't stop there, as he actually went back and redid all the illustrations for the 3 railway engines, and even made some changes to some of the illustrations in Thomas the Tank Engine. As a result, this has led to some sources incorrectly identifying Dalby as the first illustrator for the series. Now, with 3 railway engines, it's immediately obvious what he changed, but with Thomas the Tank Engine, it's a bit more nuanced. One of the main ways that you can tell the difference is with how Dalby illustrates Thomas. Whenever Payne illustrates Thomas, more often than not, he'll depict him with only 1 opening on the side of his cab, whereas Dalby consistently depicts him with 2, those being the door and the window. There are also other illustrations where Dalby kind of changes the context of them. For example, in this illustration from Thomas and Gordon, Thomas is facing away from Gordon as he brings in the coaches, whereas Dalby has the 2 very clearly looking at each other. Or in Thomas and the Trucks, Payne illustrates Thomas sliding into a siding as he's getting ready to crash, whereas Dalby just has Thomas going in a straight line.
Wasn't it obvious?
Why would that be obvious?
But otherwise, the rest of the illustrations are relatively the same, save for the coloring. But anyways, with that history lesson out of the way, let's get into the actual artwork, starting with the aforementioned colors. Now, right from the start, Dalby has a much brighter palette compared to Payne, and especially Middleton, and personally, I'm a fan. Where Thomas's book was a lot heavier on all the blues and browns, Dalby's books generally have a much wider variety of colors, and the brightness of the colors makes every shot feel much more vibrant, even in the more industrial settings. But again, Payne only managed 1 book before his death, so we don't entirely know how things would have changed. Focusing more on Dalby's personal strengths, something I've noticed is just how much he loves playing with the perspective in his shots. He's constantly changing the angles from which we view the characters, and it makes a lot of the illustrations feel much more dynamic. Granted, Middleton would do a similar thing in some of his illustrations, but I feel Dalby's is more impressive because of just how much more detailed everything is. Again, I hate to bring him up, but with Payne, a lot of the shots that we got of Thomas and the others were always 3/4 angles, taken from an above view looking down towards them, with only 1 real profile shot, that being of Thomas's first illustration. Whereas Dalby does those shots as well, but he also gives us shots of the engines from in front, behind. He even gives us shots looking up at them from beneath them, and even does a few over-the-shoulder angles. But I'd argue that Dalby's most consistent habit with these illustrations is his wide shots. There will constantly be illustrations where Dalby just has everything zoomed out, to give you not just a look at the engines, but the environment that they're in. In fact, in some of these shots, I'd argue that the engines take a back seat, which again really helps breathe life into the island of Sodor. And while many of these shots are of grassy areas, I still argue that helps to give a better idea of where Thomas and the others live, besides the railway, of course. Just a side note, something interesting I noticed while looking up illustrations for the video is that a lot of the concept art for seasons 1 to 5 of the show feels very reminiscent of Dalby's illustrations. In some cases, it's the simplistic look of the engines, or just the way everything is framed and all the composition within it. On your screen right now are some comparisons, along with images that just feel very in line with how he would have drawn things. Now, with all the praise I've been giving him, along with the 8 years spent on the series, you'd think that Awdry and Dalby got along pretty well as they worked together on the books. Well, to answer that question, I'd like to show you some recently discovered footage of the 2 interacting.
I'm going to kill you?
and then kill you again.
They didn't get along. That was largely Dalby's fault. You see, I describe Dalby as being a mix of what came before him. He had the talent, much like Reginald Payne did, but he had the mindset of William Middleton. You see, AWDRY was a massive stickler for realism, and as a part of that, he was adamant that Thomas and the others would all be based on real-life engines. As I mentioned earlier, Thomas only got accepted in the form he was due to technicality. However, like Middleton, Dalby could care less about that, and basically just did his own thing for most of his tenure. AWDRY felt that the engines looked a bit too toy-like for his own taste, and he had qualms with two characters especially. Let's start with Henry. In AWDRY's original illustrations, you can notice that Henry has a different wheel arrangement compared to how it is in the books and later the show, because originally, AWDRY wanted Henry to be based on an LNER C1 Atlantic, which looks like this. However, when it was time for Middleton to draw the illustrations, he drew Henry almost identical to Gordon, save for the color scheme, only for Henry to then be repainted in the fourth story. In Thomas the Tank Engine, Reginald Payne made the exact same mistake, but this time it was worse, since now Henry was the same color as Gordon, making them even harder to distinguish. For those wondering, the difference is that Henry's funnel has a copper cap at the top, whereas Gordon's is just pure black. And then here comes Dalby, another guy who doesn't really care for railways or realism, making the exact same mistake. It got to the point that AWDRY actually considered writing Henry out of the books entirely, but he was eventually convinced to change his mind, and so just wrote a story where Henry had an accident and got rebuilt. And when asked about his old shape, AWDRY just made up the claim that Henry was made from plans for a false engine. Now, the other character I'm talking about got his start during Dalby's tenure, that being Percy, who I'd argue is more contentious. See, AWDRY was able to find workarounds for Henry and eventually retcon him, as well as transform him into the character that he wanted him to be. But Percy never really got that treatment. If you exclude all the extra complications with Henry, Percy was technically the first Thomas character to not have an actual basis, and that really annoyed AWDRY. Granted, Dalby had depicted characters before Percy, like Bertie the Bus and Terence the Tractor, and he would go on to illustrate other characters afterwards, like Toby, Duck, and the Skarloey Railway engines. But Percy was definitely the one that broke the camel's back. A few sources have stated that AWDRY and Dalby's relationship reached its boiling point when AWDRY made a comment about Percy being a green caterpillar with red stripes, and eventually Dalby had enough, so he left the books. Honestly, I find it funny how every time the publishers pick an illustrator for AWDRY, they wind up raising his blood pressure. But jokes aside, it was AWDRY's turn to pick the publisher yet again, and pick he did. After his tumultuous relationship with Dalby, AWDRY had to find yet another illustrator for his series. In 1957, he found John T. Kenny. While both illustrators trained at the same college, AWDRY got on very well with Kenny. Kenny was also a massive rail fan and would often illustrate trains on his free time. And as a result, he had a much better idea of how to depict the characters in his illustrations. As was the case when bringing on new illustrators, Kenny was brought on shortly after the previous one left to illustrate the 12th book in the series, The 8 Famous Engines. Funnily enough, Kenny almost had a one-book tenure, similar to the first two illustrators, as where Middleton underperformed and Payne passed away, The 8 Famous Engines was intended to be the last book in the series. However, AWDRY was convinced to continue, and so Kenny continued working on the book up until 1962, with the release of Gallant Old Engine. However, like Dalby, Kenny wouldn't stop there, as he actually became the first illustrator to draw a map of the island of Sodor, and if I was willing to guess, AWDRY had a lot of creative oversight. Now, knowing all that probably begs the question of what Kenny did to make AWDRY want him so much in the first place. Well, looking at some of his work outside of Thomas, I think I can see why. Kenny liked to use a lot of darker colors, usually with more earthier tones. I failed to mention this in his section, but two more things that AWDRY couldn't stand about Dalby were his use of colors and the way he proportioned the engines, as he felt that they contributed to the more toy-like feel everything had. And in defense of the colors, I'd say that Dalby toned things back as his time went on, though Kenny definitely had him beat with how the engines were designed. Which brings me to his work on Thomas. As is the case with this kind of work, the art style changes with the sensibilities of the illustrators who are working on them, alongside the intentions of the author. In this case, the goal was to give Thomas and the others a more realistic feel, and I think Kenny delivered with that. The engines are clearly bigger and have longer proportions compared to Dalby's illustrations. Where Dalby tended to change the proportions of the engines based on the angle we saw them from, Kenny stuck pretty consistently to a specific size size and shape for each character. No doubt thanks to his aforementioned experience. At the same time though, I like how despite the clear differences, Kenny still pulls from what came before, specifically in terms of the engine's designs overall. He just depicts it differently. But anyways, also like Dalby, Kenny is very good with environments. All of the areas that the engines move around in not only feel distinct from each other, but again, they feel vibrant. They have a lot of life to them. Kenny especially loved depicting the countryside, as you can often see in the backgrounds of these illustrations. And he also did a bit more with the humans. While Dalby did do stuff with the humans, it was usually them standing in whatever position he needed them to be in, whereas Kenny depicts them doing multiple things. In this illustration from Thomas Comes to Breakfast, you can see a guy riding on his bike looking back at Thomas just before he hits the road. In The Deputation, while Percy's talking to Edward, you can see the station master clearly trying to warm his hands as he walks around on the platform. And in this illustration, you can see the passengers clearly rallying against James as he's being difficult. While he doesn't go as crazy with the perspective as Dalby does, he still finds ways to make the shots interesting. Though, much like the engine's proportions, another area where I think Kenny has Dalby beat is with the engine's faces. One issue I have with Dalby is that he kinda put a bit too much detail into the faces in certain instances, adding a bit too many wrinkles or just not always making them the best to look at. Whereas Kenny definitely dials it back a bit. Like, you can still see little details like the wrinkles on a character's face or the shading from where, like, say, their dimples are being highlighted by the sun, but it definitely doesn't look as weird. Though either way you slice it, they are still pretty easy to read. Now, with everything I've said about Kenny's work as well as the history behind it, you'd think that AWDRY was on top of the world thanks to his current position. Well, as we all know, good art has to take something from you, and ironically, it was Kenny's eyesight. He wasn't blind or anything, but it was failing him, and so he left the books. And this right here is where I'd like to make a statement. I know I made jokes about AWDRY's creative oversight and how he disagreed with a lot of the people working on the books, but it can't have been easy. Every time the publishers picked an illustrator for him, it was basically like pulling teeth, as they constantly clashed. And anytime AWDRY did pick someone he wanted, they always left due to unfortunate circumstances. What makes it sting even more is that, again, he actually seems to have gotten along pretty well with them. But like the trooper he was, he kept going. Which brings us to the 5th and 6th illustrators on the list. Eric Marriott was not the next person, but he was the Railway Series editor from 1947 all the way up to 1973. However, he did know the next illustrator, as in the period between Gallant Old Engine and the next book in the series, Marriott called up his friend Gunvor Edwards, who eventually brought her husband Peter on board, as he was better with working within the dimensions of the illustrations. The couple got their start in 1963 with the release of the Railway Series' 18th book, Stepney the Bluebell Engine, and as you'd expect, they worked pretty consistently, up until the release of Tramway Engines in 1972, which was not only their final book, but also the last Railway Series book that Wilbert Awdry would write, as he would retire the next year. Not only that, but following in Kenny's footsteps, they would also do their own illustration of the map of the island of Sodor in 1971, and would work on a little surprise packet for the Railway Series in 1972. And they even did box art for a train set released in 1965. So they definitely did a lot with the time they were given, and for anyone wondering, the Edwards had a pretty good relationship with Awdry. Like Kenny, they did a lot of research on real-life railways and engines in order to prepare for the monumental task ahead of them. And so with that said, let's take a look at their work. Oh. Well, jokes aside, something you might notice right out the gate is just how much darker all the colors are. I mean, yeah, Kenny definitely didn't use the brightest colors, and Dalby definitely toned his down, but there's a much greater emphasis on the shadows in a lot of these illustrations. Even when characters are placed directly in the sunlight with nothing obscuring them, they're always so heavily shaded, especially in the first book, which, as I said earlier, helps to set everything apart. Not only that, but the way the engines are designed is also unique. While Kenny definitely made an effort to make the engines look more realistic, he still had a more simplistic look to everything, whereas the Edwards definitely go all in with the realistic detail. Stuff like this is especially apparent when looking at the tank engine characters, who generally got a lot of focus in these books. As a result of being smaller engines, a lot of times I feel like the illustrators would generally make them a lot more simplistic compared to the tender engines. But here I feel like they're given a much more equal treatment. Like, despite their size, these guys are heavy-duty machines. In general, the engines have a much more well-worn, industrial look to them. like under all the new coats of paint, is a hard-working, heavy-duty machine. Not only that, but I feel like these are tied with Dalby for some of the best environmental illustrations that we see in the Railway series. Kenny wasn't bad at it. In fact, I really like some of his illustrations, but the engines were generally the main focus, so they took up most of the shot. However, like Dalby, the Edwards will tend to have wider shots that showcase a lot more of the layout of wherever the engines are. Places like Duck's Branch Line, the Culdee Fell, or even just random shunting yards have much more character to them as a result. And that's not even mentioning how the engine's faces are drawn. I'd say Peter and Gunn for Edwards were probably the best when it came to illustrating the engine's faces. They have a level of detail to them so that you can either tell them apart or just tell what the engines are saying. But at the same time, they still give way for some really cartoony expressions due to their simplicity. For example, in this illustration from Toad Stands By, Oliver and Duck are smiling confidently as Oliver brings Scruffy to the front of his train. Meanwhile, the trucks are looking grumpy as usual. In the next illustration, things take a complete 180, as everyone watches in horror as Scruffy gets ripped to pieces, with Oliver likely being oblivious. Or in this illustration from Bowled Out, as Duck and Stepney are bringing in the new diesel after it's broken down, you can see Duck trying not to laugh, though his face is partially obscured. Same with the other diesel, except he's boiling with anger. It's a really good balance that I feel like really isn't brought up enough when talking about the Railway series. If you couldn't already tell, I'm a pretty big fan of these guys' work, but putting personal preferences aside, I'd say that the Edwards were really solid artists with a consistent art style up until the end. But that also helped to really reflect the author's vision for the characters. And on that note, I'd also say that they were a pretty solid choice to close out the Railway series. At least, that's what I would say had they been the last ones. But for that, we need to do a little history lesson. See, a lot of things had changed in the time since Wilbert's retirement. In 1980, Britt Allcroft would acquire the rights to adapt the Railway series stories into television, and for 2 years, the pilot would be in pre-production, before being shown to distributors in 1983. That same year, Christopher Awdry, then in his 40s, would continue writing the stories that his father had told him when he was a child, and would resign from his job as a tax inspector to continue as the author, though he would need a new illustrator in order to do it. Which is where we meet Clive Spong. Spong was born in 1947, the same year that Reginald Payne died, and had actually grown up reading some of the Railway series stories. He even went to the same college as Dalby and Kenny. In 1982, Spong's agent tasked him with making sample illustrations that would wind up being used in Chris's first book and the 27th Railway series book overall, Really Useful Engines, published in 1983. After that, Spong would go on to illustrate a whopping 16 Railway series books.
Dear God. There's more.
No.
And when he wasn't doing that, he was continuing the tradition of illustrating his own version of the Island of Sodor map. And when he wasn't doing that, he was illustrating for a myriad of spin-off books set in the Railway series universe, including Thomas's Christmas Party, which Wilbert Awdry actually came out of retirement to write, making him the last illustrator to work with Wilbert, and the only illustrator to work with both authors.
But wait! There's more!
And when he wasn't doing that, he was doing illustrations for the official lore book for this series, Sodor, its people, its history, and its railways, published in 1987. All of this would eventually come to a head with the release of Thomas and His Friends, published in 2011, 4 days after Christopher's birthday, and the same year as Wilbert Awdry's 100th birthday, had he lived to see it.
This is a pretty hardcore origin story.
Yeah, and knowing all that, it'd be pretty safe to assume that Christopher Awdry and Clive Spong had a pretty good relationship, which they did. In fact, it was Chris's validation that encouraged Spong to keep working on the books. Now, with all that said, let's take a look at some of his work on Thomas. Well, at least you remembered Thomas had a big note. Oh, god damn it. Okay, but again, jokes aside, I wouldn't call Spong a bad illustrator in the slightest. Like anyone starting a new job, he just had a rough go at things to begin with, which makes sense. All the illustrations you see on your screen are actually from the first book, and you can definitely see the difference as time goes on. Again, this isn't a bad thing, but similar to Middleton, I feel like Spong's illustrations are what people visualize when they hear that Thomas and the others are children's book characters. illustrators, especially from the time period that they were written. Though, much like Dalby, I definitely would put Spong above William Middleton on the basis that his illustrations are more detailed. But with that said, we can finally move to the elephant in the room, that being the engine's faces. Yeah, I think Spong leaned a bit too hard into the realistic detail here, which is annoying since I had just praised Peter and Gunvor Edwards for finding a good balance between realistic detail and overall simplicity. What annoys me even more is that it really feels like this is where the engine started to suffer from same face syndrome. Now, this was kind of a problem with some of the previous illustrators, but they had certain details that would set them apart. For example, Gordon and Henry's noses were pointier, Edward and Toby's noses looked more realistic, and Thomas and Percy just had balls for noses. Or how in Peter and Gunvor Edwards' illustrations, they made Mavis's face look a lot more dolled up than all the other engines. But here, it feels like all the engines' faces kind of blend together regardless of the size and shape. Also, as a result of the extra detail, it leads to some of the facial expressions feeling very restricted, and wherever they are pushed, it looks very uncanny, especially since the coloring isn't always consistent. For example, in some of the earlier books, the engines have these gray faces, like usual. However, as time goes on, they start to become more flesh-colored, and so it just looks weird. Something I definitely think doesn't help is that a lot of Spong's illustrations feel kinda stiff. Like, no matter what, it always feels like the engines are kinda just sitting on whatever part of the track that they're on whenever they're in a shot, even when it's shown that they're supposed to be moving. This is especially noticeable when you see the crashes. Admittedly though, it wouldn't be fair to pull Spong aside for this, as Thomas's illustrators generally aren't that great about showing the utter carnage that these characters get into. At the same time though, I do feel that they did a much better job of showcasing the aftermath of a lot of the accidents, as well as just the general motion of the engines. For example, whenever Dalby wanted to show the engines moving, not only would he have the steam going in whatever direction that the engines were moving, he'd also make sure to show motion lines to give out the sense that these guys were speeding along, even in scenes where they probably should be going slowly. Something that Payne and the Edwards also did. And focusing more on the Edwards, another detail you'll notice is that the engine's wheels look kinda blurred. Like whenever they want to show that the engines are moving fast, they'll do that to show how quickly the wheels are spinning. Like in that illustration from Toad Stands By. It really highlights just how hard Oliver was pulling when Scruffy broke apart. Or in Bowled Out, when Duck and Stepney have to pull a heavy express train. It shows just how hard the engines are working, alongside the darkened smoke coming out of their funnels. Whereas this illustration from Triple Header lacks those qualities, and thus it looks less dynamic. Admittedly though, outside of the images I've shown you, the Edwards didn't actually do this very often, and I didn't even mention Kenny in this part since he never did it to begin with. So, much like before, I don't think it's fair to pull Spong aside for this. And throughout this section, I feel like I've been overly negative. So to bring up a positive, I'd say that he continues the tradition of having some pretty solid wide shots. Now, similar to Kenny, they aren't as big or grandiose, but they are still very technically impressive. And I feel that these are the points where he really got to show off his artistic skills. Not only that, but as I said earlier, I feel his skills saw an immense improvement over time, which likely wouldn't have been possible if he had been let go sooner. But with that, I'd say that we're done with Spong's section, and this time, for real, done with all the illustrators and Thomas. However, there's still one more thing we need to do. From fumbled beginnings to a conflicted conclusion, I'd say that Thomas has had quite the roller coaster in the visual department. But with all that information aside, that begs the question that nobody asked. From worst to best, how would I rank them? Note that I'm not saying that any of the illustrators were bad at what they did. Rather, I just feel that some did better than others. Also, AWDRY will be exempt from this list since his illustrations were never officially used. But with that said, let's do this in chronological order, starting with William Middleton. Now, as I said in his section, I definitely feel like his art is a massive departure from everyone else. But different doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, at least compared to his mindset. But that aside, I'd say Middleton gets a solid C ranking. Not bad enough to fail, but not necessarily good enough to get high marks. After that, we have Reginald Payne. Now, Payne definitely did a lot despite only doing one book, as he was the first one to not only depict Thomas and the others as actual steam engines, but the first one to draw Thomas in general, as he had never appeared in 3 railway engines. So there was a lot riding on how he depicted him, which brings me to his weaknesses. See, Payne did a really good job illustrating Thomas, but Thomas is the only one he really got to draw consistently since the book was about him. So we were never really given a good look at how he'd draw the other characters aside from Gordon, because he and Thomas shared the story. As a result, I'd say that Payne teeters between the B and A tier. It's a high mark, but it just needed a little more to really cement its place. Now, on to C. Reginald Dalby. While I can never stress enough how important Payne was in literally shaping Thomas and the others as we know them today, Dalby definitely got more chances to depict them consistently. Now, how good he was at that really depended on which book you looked at, but again, you cannot deny his talent, especially when it came to the environments. Something I failed to mention is that Dalby was, by trade, an environmental artist, so of course that's where he'd excel. As a result, where Payne helped to shape Thomas and the characters, Dalby really helped to shape the world that they lived in, even if he never got the chance to draw a map. Similar to Payne, Dalby teeters the line between two tiers, though he teeters between the S and A tier, as I feel that Dalby's really close to being truly great, save for how he draws the engines as well as his attitude. Up next we have John Kenny. Now, where Dalby leaned into brighter colors and slightly simpler designs, I feel like Kenny leaned a lot more on a down-to-earth and slightly more realistic feel, thanks in large part to his darker colors. Now, compared to some of the other illustrators, I feel like Kenny definitely pulled a lot more from what came before him, as he pretty much uses the same designs as Dalby did in his illustrations, except he proportions the engines more realistically, and gives them more realistic details overall. Not only that, but aside from Payne, I feel like Kenny was the first illustrator to really nail the engines' faces and how to draw them, while also doing some really good environmental shots, though he never got to do as many wide shots as Dalby. And given how well he got along with AWDRY, I'd say he earned his spot in the S tier. And then we have the Edwards. Now, Kenny definitely started the push towards more realism in the illustrations, but the Edwards definitely ran with that idea. Mix that with impressionist artwork and a completely different aesthetic, and you have some really gripping illustrations. Where Spong and Middleton feel more in line with how the general public would probably see Thomas as a book character, I feel like the Edwards are how AWDRY imagined the characters in his head when writing them down. But aside from me putting words in people's mouth, I definitely think they deserve to be in the S tier alongside Kenny. And finally, we have Clive Spong. He's a B tier. Now I know what you're probably thinking, but ow, didn't you just spend 4 minutes criticizing 28 years of this guy's life? Well, yes, but I still have a lot of respect for him. Something I constantly prefaced in that section was that a lot of the mistakes or things I disliked about Spong were not exclusive to his work, even if it was less prevalent there. I do not love how he drew the engine's faces, but that gives me no right to discredit the rest of his work. Spong was not lazy. He had 28 years to improve his work, and he did. And personal opinion here, I feel like Spong's illustrations wouldn't be as contentious if he wasn't the last illustrator in the series. But with those personal thoughts aside, I'd say Spong falls very comfortably into his position. And if we're being real, regardless of your personal thoughts on them, you gotta admit, all these guys would look pretty good hanging up on a wall. And with that, we've not only analyzed, but thoroughly ranked all 7 illustrators in Thomas. This is honestly a really fun video to make, as while I was definitely familiar with a good bit of the information, it was fun sharing it with you guys. Now, before I forget, alongside the Thomas Wiki, which is where I found most of the information, I'd like to give a huge shout to 2 YouTubers, that being Daniel Celano and Galloping Sausage, as most of the images you see are from their videos, as they had some of the best quality images. And I'd also like to thank the Unlucky Tug for some of the early AWDRY illustrations. But getting back on topic, like I said at the start, Thomas has a really storied history behind his illustrators, and so it was fun to put that all into one place, which is where I bring things to you. Tell me down in the comments section, what's your personal ranking of the Thomas illustrators and why? Also, as a bonus question, are you into Thomas? If so, how did you get into Thomas? As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe today to join the A-list. And have a great day. Bye!